It took one exhausted night shift nurse to see what 3 attending physicians and a team of specialists had completely overlooked, and it nearly cost her everything to say it out loud. The 7th floor of St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto wasn't the kind of place where people asked too many questions. Everyone who worked there understood that, in an unspoken way that settled into your bones after your first week on the unit. The patients on the 7th floor had private security posted outside their doors. They had personal physicians flown in from Geneva and New York. They had family members who wore suits that cost more than a nurse's monthly salary, and who looked at the hospital staff the way people looked at furniture, useful, replaceable, and not worth speaking to directly. Sorcha Quinn had been a nurse for 4 years, and she'd worked the 7th floor for 2 of them. She'd learned early that the best way to survive up here was to do your job, document everything, and keep your eyes forward. She wasn't here to understand these people. She was here to keep them alive. She was good at it, too. That was the part no one ever said to her face, but she knew it in the quiet way you know things about yourself when you've done something long enough. She noticed things, small things. The way a patient's breathing shifted before the monitors caught it. The way a medication chart told a story between the lines if you read it carefully enough. Her nursing supervisor, a woman named Patricia, who wore her silver hair in a bun so tight it looked structural, had told her once that Sorcha had the best clinical instincts she'd seen in a decade. Patricia wasn't the type to say things twice, so Sorcha had filed it away and never mentioned it again. She wasn't thinking about any of that on the Tuesday morning. She first noticed something was wrong with Mr. Harlan Voss. Harlan Voss was 68 years old, the patriarch of the Voss family, and the kind of man whose presence rearranged the air in a room before he even walked into it. He'd been admitted 3 weeks earlier following what his private physician had documented as a mild ischemic stroke. Nothing immediately life-threatening, just significant enough to require monitoring and rehabilitation. He'd been recovering steadily for the first week. Then, for reasons no one could satisfactorily explain, he'd stopped recovering. His neurological function was declining in small but measurable increments. He was sleeping more, he was eating less. The attending neurologist, Dr. Farrow, had adjusted his medications twice and ordered a second MRI. The results had come back unremarkable. Dr. Farrow had used the phrase post-stroke fatigue syndrome in his notes, which was the kind of diagnosis that sounded like an explanation, but wasn't really one. Sorcha had read that note 3 times. She was doing her morning rounds when she paused at the foot of Mr. Voss's bed and looked at him the way she looked at all her patients, not at his chart, not at his monitors, but at him, at his face, at the particular quality of stillness he had that morning, which was different from the stillness of a man resting. It was the stillness of a man who was fading. She checked his chart again. His blood pressure had been inconsistent, in a way that didn't match his documented medication doses. Not wildly inconsistent, just slightly. Enough that it could be explained away as normal variation, which was exactly what Dr. Farrow's notes had done. But Sorcha had been charting this man's vitals for 2 weeks, and she knew the difference between variation and pattern. She pulled up his medication logs from the past 10 days and stood there in the hallway, staring at her tablet, long enough that one of the junior nurses asked if she was all right. "Fine," she said without looking up. "Just reading." The numbers were wrong, not dramatically wrong, just consistently, quietly, persistently wrong in a way that made the back of her neck go cold. She told herself she was probably missing something. She told herself Dr. Farrow had 4 times her training and access to information she didn't have. She put the tablet down, finished her rounds, and went home at the end of her shift. She didn't sleep. She came back the next morning and checked the logs again. Still wrong. There was a man who sat outside Harlan Voss's room every day, from 8 in the morning until 6 in the evening. He was in his late 30s, dark-haired, with the kind of jawline that looked like it had been drafted by someone who took their work seriously. He wore suits the way other men wore their skin, effortlessly, completely, as if he'd never owned anything else. His name was Stellan Voss, Harlan's younger son, And he was, by every available measure, the most controlled human being Sorcha had ever encountered. He didn't pace. He didn't cry. He didn't do the small, desperate things that most family members did when someone they loved was declining in front of them. He sat in that chair by the window with his phone and his coffee, and his expression of absolute unreadable composure, and he watched his father the way a person watched something they'd already decided the outcome of. Sorcha had noticed that, too. She noticed everything. She just hadn't decided yet what it meant. The thing she hadn't told anyone. The thing she was still turning over in her mind at 2 in the morning in her apartment, her cat asleep on the chair across from her, and a cold cup of tea on the table, was this. The inconsistency in Harlan Voss's blood pressure didn't correlate with his charted medication times, but it did correlate almost perfectly with the hours when Stellan Voss was not in the room. On the days Stellan left early, the numbers were worse. She was a nurse, not a detective. She knew that. She kept reminding herself of that. But she was also a person who had spent 4 years learning to read the story a patient's body was telling. And right now, Harlan Voss's body was telling her that something was being done to him. Not something that had happened to him. Something that was being done. She went back through 3 weeks of nursing notes. She cross-referenced medication administration times with vital sign entries. She pulled the records of every staff member who had accessed his room outside of scheduled care hours. It took her 4 nights of her own time, sitting in the break room after her shift with a lukewarm coffee and a growing sense of dread, before she found it. 2 nurses had documented medication administration at times that didn't match the pharmacy dispensing records. Not both of them intentionally. That much became clear when she dug deeper. One of the entries was a documentation error, the kind that happened when someone was charting 3 patients at once and clicked the wrong time field. Sorcha had made that mistake herself early on. She knew what it looked like. The other one was not a mistake. Nurse Aldrich. The name on the record was R. Aldrich, a per diem nurse who came in twice a week and had been assigned to the Voss family's private rotation specifically, had documented administering Harlan's blood pressure medication at 10:15 a.m. on a Tuesday. The pharmacy log showed the medication had been dispensed at 10:47 a.m. You couldn't administer a medication 32 minutes before it was dispensed. That wasn't a documentation error, that was a fabrication. Sorcha sat with that for a long time. Then she went back and checked every shift R. Aldrich had worked on the 7th floor over the past 3 weeks, and the cold that had started in her neck spread slowly down her spine. The pattern held every time. She didn't go to Dr. Farrow. She'd thought about it. She'd almost done it twice, but Dr. Farrow had been Harlan Voss's personal physician for 11 years, and the Voss family paid his retainer directly. She didn't know what that meant. She didn't know if it meant anything. But she'd learned, in 2 years on this floor, that loyalty in this world was financial, it was personal. And she didn't have enough certainty yet to trust the wrong person with what she'd found. She went to Patricia instead. She laid it out carefully. The medication logs, the pharmacy discrepancies, the vital sign patterns, the charting irregularities. And Patricia listened without interrupting, which was how Sorcha knew she was taking it seriously. Patricia only went quiet when something mattered. When Sorcha finished, Patricia looked at her for a long moment. "You're certain," Patricia said. "It wasn't a question." "I'm certain about the documents," Sorcha said. "What they mean. I have a theory. I don't have proof." "What's your theory?" Sorcha met her supervisor's eyes. "Someone is adjusting his medication doses outside of the charted schedule, not increasing them. Diluting them, enough that his blood pressure control is failing, slowly in a way that looks like post-stroke progression." Patricia was quiet again for a beat. "You understand what you're saying?" "I do." "And Aldrich? He's been in this building twice a week for 3 weeks. He's never worked this floor before this admission." Patricia reached for the phone on her desk. Sorcha put her hand over it, gently. "Not yet. Not until we know who he's working for." That was the part that scared her most, because it could be anyone. It could be a business rival who'd managed to place someone on the inside. It could be someone within the hospital administration. It could be someone within the Voss family itself. She thought about Stellan Voss in his chair by the window, watching his father with that quality of stillness that looked less like grief and more like waiting. She thought, I hope I'm wrong about you. She didn't go home that night. She stayed late, charting, watching the floor, and she was at the nursing station at 11 p.m. when she saw R. Aldrich badge into the unit. He wasn't scheduled. She watched him on the hallway camera feed on her station monitor. The 7th floor had cameras in the corridors, which was standard for high-security patients, and she watched him walk directly to the medication room. He was in there for 4 minutes. Then he walked toward Harlan Voss's room. Sorcha was already moving. She didn't run. Running on a hospital floor at night would wake patients and draw the wrong kind of attention. She walked quickly, precisely, the way she'd learned to move when something was going wrong, and she needed to get there before it got worse. She pushed open the door to Harlan's room and Aldrich spun around. He had a syringe in his hand. For a moment neither of them spoke. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm. Harlan Voss lay still in his bed, his chest rising and falling, unaware. You're not on shift tonight, Sorcha said. Her voice came out steady. She was genuinely surprised by that. Aldrich's face went through several things in quick succession before landing on something that looked almost like calm. I forgot to document something from this morning. With a syringe. He didn't answer. Sorcha moved to put herself between him and the IV line. She was aware that this was a dangerous thing to do. She was also aware that she was not going to step aside regardless. I'm going to need you to leave that with me, she said. And then I'm going to need you to come with me to the nursing station, where we're going to wait together for security. You can call whoever you need to call on the way. Something shifted in his expression. For just a second, it looked like calculation. She'd seen that look before in people who were deciding whether the situation could still be managed. She held his gaze and didn't move, and after a moment that felt considerably longer than it actually was, he set the syringe down on the bedside table. She picked it up. She kept her hand steady. Let's go, she said. She found out later. Much later, after the security footage had been pulled, and the syringe had been tested, and the pharmacy logs had been formally audited, that the Voss family's elder son, Conrad, had arranged the whole thing. Conrad, who was 12 years older than Stellan, and who had been quietly losing his grip on the family's assets for the past 2 years, as Harlan had increasingly turned to his younger son for business decisions. Conrad, who had found a per diem nurse through a contact she didn't want to think too hard about, and paid him to systematically dilute his father's blood pressure medication over weeks, slow enough to look like natural decline. The plan had been elegant in its way. If Harlan died of what appeared to be progressive post-stroke complications, there would be no investigation. There would just be grief and an estate, and a family structure that would shift decisively in Conrad's favor. It had almost worked. Dr. Farrow, to his genuine credit, had not been involved. He'd simply been fooled, the way any doctor could be fooled by data that was being quietly manipulated before it reached him. He'd been practicing medicine in good faith on bad information, which was a particular kind of professional horror that Sorcha hoped he'd be able to process eventually. She didn't think about Conrad very much in the weeks that followed. She thought about him briefly when the police came to take her formal statement, and again when Patricia told her that Conrad had retained a lawyer, and was apparently planning to dispute the interpretation of certain evidence. Patricia said this in the tone of someone reporting weather, matter of fact, with the implication that the weather was not their problem. Sorcha appreciated that. What she thought about more, in the weeks that followed, was the morning that Stellan Voss came to find her. She was in the staff lounge on her break, eating a sandwich and reading something on her phone, when the door opened and he was there. He looked, for the first time since she'd seen him, like a person who had been through something. The suit was still perfect. The jawline was still the same. But there were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there before, and he was holding a coffee cup from the cafe downstairs with both hands, like he needed something to hold on to. She put down her phone. "Nurse Quinn," he said. "Mr. Voss." He looked at her for a moment as if he was searching for the right beginning and couldn't find one. Then he said, "My father asked for you this morning. He wanted me to tell you that he considers what you did an act of extraordinary courage." Sorcha thought about this. "I was doing my job." His words, Stellan said quietly, were that you were doing everyone else's job as well as your own, and that the hospital should, I'm quoting him directly here, do something substantial about that before she gets tired of being undervalued and leaves. A pause. Something that might have been a smile crossed his face, there and gone. He made me write it down. He's very precise about wording when he wants something on record. She laughed before she could stop herself. It surprised her, and she thought it surprised him too, because the almost smile came back and stayed slightly longer this time. "He sounds like someone worth keeping alive," she said. "He is." The simplicity of it landed quietly. Stellan looked down at his coffee cup, then back at her. "I owe you an apology, actually." She waited. "The first 2 weeks, I watched you looking at him differently than the other nurses did. I noticed you pulling his chart repeatedly, I thought." He stopped, pressed his lips together. "I thought you might be gathering information for someone. The kind of flaw this is, the kind of people who come through here. That suspicion is unfortunately not unfounded. I had security monitoring your access logs." Sorcha blinked. "You thought I was the problem. For approximately 11 days, yes." He said it with a directness she found, despite herself, oddly refreshing. No softening, no maneuvering, just the plain fact of it offered without excuse. "I was wrong, entirely and consequentially wrong, and I am sorry." She considered him. The way he'd said it, not performing the apology, not packaging it in careful language designed to minimize, made her think that Stellan Voss was someone who had learned at some point that accountability was simpler than its alternatives. "You could have come to me," she said. "Asked me directly." "I know. I should have." He paused. "I'm not always good at trusting the obvious choice." She nodded once. She understood that, actually, more than she wanted to admit. She'd spent 11 days second-guessing herself before she walked into that room at 11 p.m., and she'd almost talked herself out of it twice. "Your father," she said. "He's going to need consistent physiotherapy once he's stable enough to transfer. I can give you a list of recommended rehabilitation facilities in the city, ones that are genuinely good, not just expensive." He looked at her for a beat, and she thought she saw something in his expression recalibrate, like he'd expected a different conversation or a different ending to this one and was adjusting. "I'd appreciate that," he said. She started to reach for her phone to pull up the list, and he said, "Nurse Quinn." She looked up. "Is it always going to be Nurse Quinn?" It was the most personal thing he'd said. It came out careful, like he'd weighed it, and something about that care, the fact that a man who'd clearly never been careful about anything in his life had chosen to be careful about this, made her pause. "Sorcha," she said. He nodded. Something settled in his expression. "Thank you, Sorcha, for my father." She found the list on her phone and handed it to him, and he took it, and when their hands didn't quite overlap, she thought, well, that's something to think about later, when the paperwork is done, and her next shift hasn't already started, and she has enough sleep to think clearly about anything at all. She went back to her sandwich. She heard the lounge door close. She sat there for a moment in the quiet, thinking about the way things could turn. How a set of numbers on a medication log could be the edge of something vast. How paying attention when it would have been easier not to could pull a whole chain of events from a direction nobody saw coming. She thought about Harlan Voss, who was currently, for the first time in 3 weeks, sitting up in bed and eating breakfast and asking for the newspaper. She thought about Patricia, who had called her into the office that morning and said, with the expression of someone making a significant personal effort, "You did good work," and then immediately started talking about Q3 staffing ratios, because that was how Patricia expressed emotion. The sandwich was a bit dry. She ate it anyway. She had 18 minutes left on her break, a 12-hour shift ahead of her, and somewhere in this building a man was getting better because she'd been too stubborn to let the numbers lie to her. That was enough. That was actually more than enough. She picked up her phone and got back to work.